BlackBerry with Zinc. Hello dudes, dudettes, duders, and everyone in between. Today we're going to take a look at Dehancer, a plugin that gives digi footage a more analog feel. Full disclosure, the Dehancer team reached out to us and asked if we'd do a review. We are allowed to keep the license once the review is released, and no money changed hands. They have no editorial input, but I did contact them to double check that I got the finer points of the technical explanations of the plugin correct. Furthermore, I imagine their team will watch this video, and that presents a rare opportunity for me. So for this video, I'll be talking to you, the audience, when discussing functions of the plugin that I like. When discussing shortcomings, though, I'll address the Dehancer team directly. Let's try it. Dehancer, your film tab needs work. Our review is simple. It's a great plugin. If you want your digi footage to look and feel more analog, this will absolutely get you across the finish line, especially if you know how to use it. The plugin is available for purchase, which is excellent because we've put a freeze on new subscriptions and we won't be recommending any subscription-only services on this channel. If you're watching reviews of Dehancer trying to decide if you should buy it, we think that you probably should. It's good. It's a good plugin. The plugin is a good one. And that is as complicated as my opinion gets on the topic. But I did want to make a video with more meat on the bone, so let's talk about the tool sets you get with Dehancer. When you're in the market for these kinds of plugins, it becomes hard to tell who is selling rinky-dink little LUT packs and who is selling actual plugins that affect your footage in complicated, well-programmed ways. I could tell you that Dehancer is the latter, but I think you'll get a much better feel for the software if we go through tab by tab, setting by setting, and examine what Dehancer actually does to your footage. For this review, we'll demo the functions on SMPTE color bars and actual footage while keeping an eye towards waveform and vector scope readouts. Aesthetic changes can sometimes be hard to discern, especially after YouTube has run its compression. But the scopes can only tell the quantified truth. Men lie, women lie, waveforms don't. Let's get into those functions so that you can get back to dehancing your footage. Input. Input is a good place to start for a couple of reasons. For one, it's the first function in the chain of effects, and second, it's pretty easy to understand. This is where you set up the basic parameters of the source footage. Input defaults to Rec 709, but there are other common color profiles you can choose from, including Rec 2020 and Cineon Film Log. Beyond that, there's also the option to choose the camera you shot on, and there are a lot of options here from a lot of manufacturers. Also, it's really well organized, like really well organized. You listening, Dehancer? It's well organized. Take a look at this tab, Dehancer, and marvel at how well organized it is. We will get back to that. After you've selected the color space of your footage, you can adjust exposure, temperature, and tint controls, as one would expect. There's also an option to reduce fringing, and you can do this using the defringe and defringe radius sliders. The defringe slider is there to push back against fringerific image flaws, whether they come from chromatic aberrations on the lens, the purple fringing on digital sensors, or some other fringe-causing imperfection in your gear. Defringe affects how much defringing is happening, and the defringe radius determines the radius of the fringing that it's correcting. Finally, you have the option to turn defringing on and off. We typically leave it off because our lenses are pin sharp and our sensors are dope. Yes, that is a flex. Moving on. Film. Film is the film stock that you'd like to be emulating. This one's pretty simple and what most people start with when they're trying to get that film look. This is a collection of LUTs that you can apply to the footage along with a slider for push and pull. Push-pull is a post-processing technique done when shooting film where you intentionally underexpose or overexpose the image and then you push it or pull it in developing to compensate. This is where the film tab gets complicated, and we'll get back to that in a moment. First, I want to talk about the biggest design failure of the entire Dehancer plugin. The film stock options are terribly implemented. They come in the form of an alphabetized drop-down menu with no option for preview. So if you want to audition different stocks, you click the menu, click the film stock, click the menu, click the film stock, and so on back and forth forever until you find a base look that you like. Navigating through different stocks is as miserable an experience as one can imagine, and this is only highlighted by the fact that Resolve has already solved this puzzle. Their LUT menu is built around discovery and play, something severely lacking in Dehancer. For example, in Resolve, you don't even have to click on a LUT to see what it will look like on your footage. You just scrub your mouse back and forth over the LUT and you can see a preview. Boom! Instant LUT. Shout out Bill Toll. Furthermore, there's absolutely no organization in this tab. Modern stocks are lumped together with vintage stocks, color with black and white. The stocks are organized alphabetically, which means they are sorted by the manufacturer being emulated, not by what they actually do. Hey, Dehancer! If you're looking for ideas on how to organize this mess, why don't you tilt your eyes up 2.5 degrees and look at the Input tab of your own plugin. The puzzle has already been solved by you. What is the impediment? This all strikes me as odd because the film stock is the central artistic hub of this entire plugin. All creative decisions follow this one. You set your technical information at the Input tab and you start making art at the Film tab. This collection of LUTs is where everyone who uses the plugin is going to look first, so to have it be such a miserable experience really feels off to me. Simply put, this absolutely needs to be redesigned. First, to encourage discovery and play, and second, to make it easy to find what you like from that discovery process. Would it kill you to have the option to sort the stocks aesthetically instead of by manufacturer? Or, better yet, let the user tag stocks and sort by tags, and then you don't even have to make organizational decisions yourself? How can this tab exist without a favorites bin? Also, presets would be really helpful when dipping your toes into the cold Dehancer waters. People who are looking for film emulators at this level likely aren't in need of too much hand-holding, but some presets would be a great way to get the creative juices churning and to demonstrate to new users ways they can combine the included tools. The ability to export all settings into one file seems like it would be a natural fit so that members of your community could share what they've built. Let's get back to that push-pull slider. Push-pull behaves uniquely for each film stock, which starts to reveal the complexity of this plugin. To demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to apply 2 different stocks and then animate the slider. If you watch the scopes, you'll see how differently the image is affected between the 2 stocks, despite the fact that the push-pull keyframes are identical. Here's Portra 800 compared side by side with Lomachrome Metropolis. The slider animations are on identical keyframes, but the way it affects chroma and luma is dramatically different between the 2 stocks. The math going on under the hood and the color science it's based on are both incredibly complicated, and that topic could really be its own video. Honestly, it could be its own 2-year degree followed by a year-long laboratory mentorship, but I digress. We don't have time for that, so suffice to say, Dehancer is so much more than a LUT pack. Film Developer. Film Developer has a few options and they're fairly easy to understand. If you've done any image work in Photoshop or Lumetri Color, you're probably familiar with these functions. Contrast Boost can either increase or decrease the overall contrast of the image. Gamma Correction determines how much the midtones are moved toward the highlights or the shadows. The curve on this one is complicated, and to see what I mean, watch the waveform as I adjust the gamma. You'll see that the image is not affected in a linear way, it's not even affected in a uniform way. Moving on, we have Color Separate and Color Boost. Color Separate can increase or decrease saturation based on how saturated that part of the image is. So if you have an area of high saturation next to an area of low saturation, bringing down the Color Separate slider will decrease the saturation of the rich colors a lot while making less of an impact on the low saturation colors. If you look at the model's bikini top, you will see that color separation takes it from eye-blistering pink to something much more pleasant. But the turquoise chair next to her, while affected, isn't affected nearly so much. Color Boost is a saturation slider that affects the entire image in a much more linear fashion. While it can increase or decrease the saturation, what you'll notice is that it doesn't clip on its own. You can slide it to the maximum setting and your SMPTE colors will not exceed legal limits. Likewise, you can drag it to its lowest setting and the colors become muted, but the image never hits full black and white. Film compression. One of the advantages film has over DigiCapture is that film stock is more flexible than sensors, particularly in the highlights. Sensors clip early and often. For analog images, while quality degrades if you over or underexpose, Recovering something, anything, is more likely to be possible. Digi images, or as I like to call them, dimages, are binary. There either is signal or there isn't. If you clip into the highlights or drop your shadows to absolute black, there is simply no information there to recover. While Dehancer can't create picture information where there isn't any, it can take clipped highlights, make them less garish, and blend them with the rest of the footage. This is all done in the Film Compression tab, which affects both the luminance and the chroma of your image with count 'em, four control sliders. Before we enable film compression, let's look at the scopes for a moment so you can better understand what the color card is doing. There's a row of vertical bars across the top, all having 75% values. Left to right, we've got 75% white, yellow, cyan, green, magenta, red, and blue. And you can see those values represented across our waveform readout bang on at the 75% line. On the left and right of the card, we have 100% cyan, yellow, red, and blue. Those are a little harder to decipher on the waveform, but if we switch over to our vector scope, they become a bit easier to read. The first thing you'll notice on your vector scope are squares for yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and red. The little dots inside those squares represent the 75% color blocks on the card. If we change the saturation of the color card, you will see those dots move toward the center of the circle. If we adjust the hue of the card, you'll see them wiggle around the vector scope in weird ways. There's one more handy tool on the color card that we're going to use a lot today, and that's the gradient bar. It's the bar that goes from 0% black to 100% white. This will help you to understand tonal range sliders in Dehancer, but only if you know how to read it on the waveform. This is represented as a 45-degree line ascending from the left to the right. It goes predictably from 0% black to 100% white. With an understanding of what those two scopes do, it'll be easier to understand what film compression does to the image. We'll enable the function and you will immediately see two significant changes to the waveform readout. The first is that the grayscale line is no longer straight. There is a curve at the top, but the mids and shadows are unaffected. You'll also see that some of the 75% values have been changed, but not uniformly. Let's start adjusting the sliders. When impact is at 0, nothing happens to the image. As you slide it to the right, the highlights dip down. The further you slide it, the more the curve dips. You'll also notice that yellow, cyan, and green are affected, each a little bit less than the one before it. We will come back to that, but for now, let's look at white point. White point is the point at which white will clip in your image. Lowering the white point will increase image contrast, but you'll see that as it slides, it only affects the highlights, with the midtones adjusting a little, to smooth the curve, and the shadows being completely unaffected. Looking at the color bars, it's easiest to see what the white point slider does in the upper end of the gradient bar. As we lower the slider, more clipping is occurring at the white end of the gradient. Tonal range adjusts how much of your image is affected. You can see that as we increase this value, our adjustments not only exaggerate in the highlights, but they also impact the mids to a greater degree. The shadows, though, remain unaffected. The color density is actually easiest to see on an image instead of the color bars. Color density affects the saturation of the highlights. To demonstrate this, I'm going to boost the exposure of the overall image so that more of the skin tones are in the highlight range. Then I'm going to crank the impact, white point, and tonal range, as this will help exaggerate the effect of color density. Now, as we move the slider back and forth, you can see the saturation changing in the highlights, but not in the mids or shadows. Expand. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed after film compression, good news, expand is simpler. This function allows you to expand or compress the black and white values of the image. If you look at the waveform while I adjust the values, you'll see that it absorbs those changes in a linear fashion. This leads to an image with lower or higher contrast, depending on what you do with the sliders. There are two ways to affect your image, normal or luma. Normal pulls all information together, and you can tell because our waveforms remain a series of straight lines. However, if we switch over to Luma, you'll see steps on the different color bars. Luma mode primarily affects the luminance of the image and the chroma a little. Normal mode affects the Luma and the chroma equally. Print. Printing is the last stage before exhibition. This is when you transfer your negative to the print that will be sent to the projector for a screening or to the scanner for digi-delivery, or as I call it, digivery. Under the Print tab, you'll find a handful of options. You'll notice that for linear, Cine and Log, and Kodak Endura glossy paper, you cannot adjust the target white. The two print film options, Fujifilm 3513 and Kodak 2383, require a light to transfer the information from the negative to the next medium, and the target white is designed to compensate for the color temperature of the light bulb used in printing. So, if we set it to Fujifilm print film, we can adjust the target white and, predictably, it adjusts the blue values. The next slider is for exposure, and it does exactly what you'd expect. Tonal contrast affects the overall contrast of the image, and color density affects the saturation, impacting red, magenta, and blue much more than it does yellow, cyan, and green. To see this in action, we need do no more than load our vector scopes and make some adjustments. Pairing delightfully with the color density slider is the saturation slider, which affects the saturation in a uniform manner. Lowering the slider to 0 will render a black and white image. Finally, there's the analog range limiter. By default, this is turned off, and when it's disabled, the black and white points of the reference print are normalized to 0 and 100 respectively. When it's engaged, Dehancer uses the native contrast ratio of the optical print. This will be narrower than the contrast range of the monitor, giving you additional headroom for corrections. These corrections can be done with the Expand Adjustments slider. Colorhead. Bad news. Colorhead is a really complicated process that goes beyond the scope of this video. Good news! That doesn't matter because the impact on the image is really easy to understand, even without getting into the technical chemical processes on which it's based. The top 3 sliders allow you to make 3 decisions across 6 variables: yellow, blue, magenta, green, cyan, and red. While you can gang all the sliders, we're going to demo them one by one. Keep one eye on the vector scope and one on the color bars to see what is happening to the image. Yellow and blue tints the image across one axis. Magenta and green tints the image along another, and finally cyan and red tints the image along a third axis. It's really easy to see the ways the colors are being affected when looking at the vector scope. The shadows, midtones, and highlights sliders are easier to understand by looking at the waveforms, so we're going to switch our scope on over. The shadows tone slider affects the amount of blue in the shadows of the image, and you can see that represented as the blue curve bubbles up or down on the low end of the gradient on our color card. The midtone slider controls the blue tint in the midtones, and you guessed it, the highlights tone slider controls the blue tint in the highlights. Preserve exposure does exactly what it says. It compensates for any exposure changes that may have occurred as a result of the color head corrections. The higher the slider is, the more it will compensate for exposure changes. And as always, impact acts as an opacity slider. Film grain. Finally, let's get into what you actually came here for, grain! If you've watched the video this far, then I know that I'm in friendly enough company and we can geek out together. The grain in this plugin is top tier. Simply put, this is the best grain plugin I've ever played with. We'll get into what makes it unique in a moment, but first, let's take a look at the parameters that we can change. The size slider affects the size of the grain. If you want to emulate a low ISO film stock, go with the smaller grain. If you're trying to emulate a high ISO film stock, go with a larger grain. The next slider is the amount, and this is where the plugin really reveals its complexity. To demonstrate this, I'm going to zoom in and bring the amount up to maximum. What you'll see is that the area between the green and magenta bars is starting to corrode. This is because Dehancer actually deconstructs the image before adding the grain. To understand what I mean, we're going to turn off Dehancer and use Resolve's native film grain effect. What you'll notice is that it generates a layer of noise and then superimposes that over the image. You can tell that it's superimposed because you can actually adjust the blend mode. Dehancer's grain, on the other hand, actually breaks the image. The micro fractures that you see here are what give analog its personality. Grain is often perceived as noise to be cured in the pursuit of a cleaner signal. Really unpacking the grain function of the plugin was what gave me the feeling that the team at Dehancer and I felt the same way about grain. People who truly love shooting on film understand that grain isn't noise. Grain is signal. The medium is the message. Grain is the notes you don't play on a Pentax K1000. Diving deep into the grain function revealed another terrific design element in Dehancer that leaves Resolve's native effects in the dust. Dehancer is aggressive with its random seeding of grain. Every adjustment you make to your project seems to generate a new random seed for the grain. If I adjust the grain size slider in Resolve's effect, it will zoom in and out of the noise layer. If I adjust the size of the grain on Dehancer's, it generates a new seed for the entire grain build. But it goes beyond adjustments in the grain function tab. For example, if I adjust the chroma, it continuously generates new grain. If I make adjustments in other tabs of the plugin, it generates new grain. If I go to the Edit tab and move clips around, it generates new grain. To be clear, the plugin is on the adjustment layer, not on the SMPTE bars. Still, as I move the color bars every time I settle, it generates entirely new grain. It's the first plugin I've seen that is in a near perpetual state of generating new random seeds, and I'd love to know more about the thinking behind this decision. As interesting as this method is for building random seeds, it does create some problems with Resolve's preview rendering. Effects like this are processor intense, so real-time playback is simply not possible. I found myself wanting to render previews in Resolve, but then having trouble with playback. I'm assuming that this is because the plugin is always reseeding, causing conflicts with the renders, all of which would be based on old seeds. Resolve doesn't seem to understand that the old renders are invalid, and Dehancer doesn't seem to have a chill function. This meant that I'd have to export my edits to see the effects in motion. While not ideal, I felt like the end result was so good that I was fine with taking that hit and hoping that Dehancer gets better at communicating with Resolve, or that they introduce an option for lighter seeding, as I imagine that could unbreak the current problems with preview rendering. The film resolution governs how nasty high contrast edges get. The smaller the film resolution, the uglier those edges are going to be. The higher the resolution, the cleaner they will be. Shadows, midtones, and highlights govern how aggressive the grain will be in those ranges. This is best demonstrated on the gradient SMPTE bar. Shadows boosts the grain in the shadows, midtones boosts the midtones, and wouldn't you know it, highlights boosts the highlights. Pretty straightforward stuff. Chroma affects the saturation of the grain. Again, simple stuff that. Beyond that, there are options for film type, positive, and negative. I don't have access to Dehancer's exact algorithms, but it's easy to imagine that negative film has roughly twice as much noise as it has to be transferred from the negative strip to the print. Positive film has less grain as it goes through fewer transfers. Finally, there's analog and, I'm going to go for it here, wish me luck, digital. I prefer the analog grain because I'm an analog cowboy, yippee-ki-yay! The digi-grain is interesting because it gets more destructive to the image where high contrast information touches. This is not obvious on an actual image, but it becomes very clear on the SMPTE color bars. Halation and Bloom. Halation and Bloom are related to each other, but not quite identical. Demonstrating them side by side will not only highlight what makes them unique, but also make it easier to understand what they're doing similarly. Halation is the film stock hyperreacting to light as it passes through the film, hits the inside of the camera, and bounces back, creating orange halos around bright light sources. Bloom is the result of imperfections in the lens, and it creates a glow effect, pulling luma and chroma values from bright areas and causing them to bleed into dark areas. Both halation and bloom are most obvious when you have bright information right next to dark information. For that reason, we're going straight to the color bars for both. We'll apply the effect to actual footage in a moment. First, let's compare the effects. This is actually easy to do because Dehancer offers a mask-only mode for both functions. You're going to see a lot of action over here on the color bars. This is because you have 100% white and 100% yellow touching 100% black, so the effect will be most prominent. First, we're going to turn on bloom, and what you'll see is a hard border with the colors bleeding onto where the black is, but not onto where the source colors are. This is because bloom and halation primarily affect the shadows and secondarily affect the mids. They don't really affect the highlights. To understand what I mean, take a look at the right side of the color card and you'll see that the blue bars bleed into themselves, boosting the brightness and the saturation, but they don't affect the adjacent white blocks. Bloom and halation both take their cues from the bright areas of your image and apply that to the dark areas. Let's take a look at how halation differs from bloom. The first thing you'll notice is that halation presents as orange uniformly, regardless of the color that caused it. Let's get into settings, first for halation and then for bloom. To highlight what's happening, we're going to zoom in on the gradient bar while also keeping an eye on the 100% white, cyan, and yellow area of the card. The source of halation is an image highlight. Limiting the source means narrowing the amount of brightness necessary to cause the halation. The higher we move the source limiter slider, the greater the contrast between the highlight and the shadow needs to be for halation to occur. You can see this as we raise the slider and confine the halation to only the highest contrast areas of the image. The source limiter affects how aggressive the highlights are on the image. The background gain slider, on the other hand, affects how sensitive the shadows are to halation. As we adjust this, you'll see the effect of the halation increase and decrease based on the darkness of the area being affected, not based on the brightness of the area causing the effect. As the background becomes more sensitive, it takes less light to affect it. As the background becomes more resilient, it takes more. Smoothness does not demo well on the color cards because it's based on a relationship between large areas of highlights and small points of highlights. The higher the smoothness value is, the more the halation or bloom effect will be focused on large pockets of highlights instead of little tiny pins of light here and there. We can see this clearly on the model's glasses. We have bits of gold in the glasses that have highlights. Some of the filament is fine and the leaves are bigger. As we increase the smoothness, the halation caused by the finer filaments will fade away, but the halation caused by the large gold leaves will remain and soften. Local and global diffusion are both best demonstrated on the image of the model. As we boost the local diffusion, you'll see that the light leaking from the highlights spreads out, affecting a broader swath of the image. Global diffusion not only increases the spread of halation, but also drags the shadows and mids of the entire image up with it. Things mercifully get a bit simpler from here on out. Amplify increases the amount of damage this bouncing light does to your film stock. To understand hue, you have to understand that halation primarily affects the red layer of the film stock. Boosting the hue slider increases the amount that the green layer of the emulsion is affected. To demo this, we'll focus on the gold in the model's glasses. Gold has a good amount of green in it, and this is revealed as we move the hue slider. You can see the amount of damage being done to greens increases while the damage being done to reds, for example her skin tones, remains largely the same. Also, if you look at the scopes, you can see the amount of green in the halation growing as the signal gets messier. To understand blue comp, we'll go back to the color bars and zoom in on the blue bar. The first thing we're going to do is turn down the hue, and as I do, watch how dramatically the magenta and red bars change. Halation is dampened by cool colors, and blue compensation allows you to reduce the influence blue has on the visibility of halation. The higher the slider, the less blue dampens the halation effect, the more the effect will present. To demo this, we'll load up the scopes and focus on the 75% blue bar. You can see as we move it how the image values change. Finally, we get to impact and mask mode. Impact changes how much the function affects the overall image. Mask mode allows you to see only the effect without looking at the actual image. We've been doing all of our adjustments in mask mode, so let's turn that off and see what horrors we've actually created. That looks predictably terrible. Let's turn that nonsense off and noodle with the bloom function. Bloom. With all that groundwork laid in halation, bloom is going to go much quicker. It doesn't hurt that most of the sliders are the same between the two functions. If you came here just to learn bloom, I apologize. I'd strongly encourage you to go back and watch the halation section because we cover a lot of the basics for bloom over there. The highlight slider sets the brightness range that will create a bloom. The higher the slider setting, the wider the tonal range. This is a bit different from the source limiter, which works the same as the halation effect, limiting the source as you move the slider to the right. As with halation, details is best demonstrated on the image of the model. The lower the value is, the smaller the object needs to be to create the bloom effect. As the slider increases, the larger the highlight has to be to cause the bloom. Diffusion is fairly easy to understand. This is the amount that the bloom effect spreads out across the image. Amplify increases or decreases the impact the bloom has on the shadows and mids. Save lights is a function that allows you to protect or destroy the highlights of the image. A higher value protects your highlights and a lower value runs roughshod on them. For maximum impact, we're going to leave that value low for now. The next slider is saturation, and this determines how much chroma information is getting dragged along with the luma information. If the value is high, your bloom will be high saturation. If it's low, the bloom will only carry luma, not the chroma. Finally, there's impact, which affects, as always, how much the function is applied to your image. As with halation, there's an option for mask mode, and we're now going to turn that off and reveal our final image. Perfect, no notes, moving on. Vignette. Who doesn't enjoy a nice balsamic vignette? Ha? This one is pretty straightforward. It's your typical vignette effect. To make it easier to see how we're changing the vignette, I'm going to turn the feather value down to 0, which results in a hard edge. Exposure controls how light or dark the vignette will be. We're going to go excessively dark just for demonstration purposes. The size slider controls, well, the size. Aspect ratio controls whether your vignette is a circle, a vertical oval, or a horizontal oval. We'd like to go horizontal with 16:9 footage. And the center controls where, the center is. Once you have something that you like, you can crank the feather and make your final adjustments. Film breadth. Film breadth and gate weave are related but not identical. These are a pair of imperfections that happen either in the camera gate or on the print bed. Film breadth is a function that affects the exposure, contrast, or color from frame to frame. Gate weave simulates imperfect film registration as it moves through the camera. First, let's look at film breadth. This one is difficult to see on the color card, so we'll focus on the scopes for a clearer picture of what's going on. The first slider affects the speed at which these variations occur. We'll come back to that after we've cranked the other settings. Exposure controls the amount of variation possible in the exposure. Tonal contrast adjusts the amount that, tonal contrast can be affected, and color affects, you guessed it, color. Impact changes how much the function is applied to your footage. With everything maxed out, we can now look at period. This controls the refresh rate of the effect. The lower the number, the faster the refresh. Hey, all you fans of random seed generation, buckle up. Something interesting revealed itself while I was noodling with gate breadth. I am starting to wonder if the seeds are less random and more progressive, because you can see the seed get pushed progressively forward as you edit. To see this happen in real time, simply grab a slider that isn't engaged and start wiggling it back and forth. If you watch the scope, you'll see the plugin continue to march forward through its prescribed motion. Further testing revealed that any action at all in Resolve will push the seed forward. For example, right now I'm tapping Shift-Command-Z with an empty undo cache, so it's not doing anything to the timeline or the software, but the input is pushing the random seed forward in a non-random way. The interesting thing about this is that striking Shift and Command alone won't push the seed forward. It's only when I do an actual input. You may return now from the edge of your seat. Gate weave. Gate weave replicates how poor film registration plays out on screen. This causes the actual shot to shake and stutter from frame to frame. Again, this one is fairly easy to understand. X and Y translation represent how much the film can move on the X and Y axis respectively. Rotation controls how much it rotates. Impact is how much your footage is affected by the function. We leave auto zoom enabled. If you turn this off, it will replicate edge pixels to fill in the gaps, and this doesn't look great, as you can see in the lower right corner of this frame. Period affects how long these cycles of randomness last. The lower the number, the quicker the variables change. Extras. There are functions beyond the ones we've covered so far, but these are simpler, so I'm lumping them together. Under Monitor, you can turn false color on and off, as well as clipping indicators. Output allows you to adjust the overall impact of all functions combined. The LUT generator allows you to create a LUT based on some of the adjustments you've made, but not all, for sharing with your buddies on the playground. For example, the LUT won't carry bloom or grain, among other functions. I suppose if you were a dingus, you could export the film stocks one by one and load them into Resolve and do your LUT previews there, but, you know, lame. Finally, you have options, which include options for your render quality as well as licensing info and a check profiles function. When installing the plugin and opening it for the first time, you have to run the check profiles function, so I wonder if this should be at the top of the chain instead of the bottom, but that's not a make or break issue. And that covers it. I hope this review was helpful. It's a great plugin with a rich feature set and robust math going on under the hood. I feel like I've covered everything, but if anything was unclear or incomplete, please leave a comment below and we'll either reply to your comment directly or we'll do a follow-up video. Either way, we are very happy to hear from you. I've only used the plugin in Resolve, but if you have questions about Final Cut Pro, After Effects, Premiere, or their iOS application, there is a link in the description for all of the manuals. Also, wouldn't you know it, there's a link to Dehancer's website. If you feel like this plugin could help your workflow, but you don't want to pay full price, you can use our promo code. That's right. We have a promo code all our own. DUDER, Duder, will get you 10% off. Station. And now the video must be over because if it gets any longer, it'll get bumped from the shorts category to features, and we are trying to avoid that. Now please stop watching YouTube and get back to dehancing your footage. Bye.